Hello and welcome. I'm Susie, and this is my podcast. I'm glad to have you here, and I hope you're ready to hear some ideas about justice, because here they come. What is justice? Why is it so difficult to achieve? Can there be justice without law? Law without justice? There are many different forms or ideas of justice. Punitive justice in the form of incarceration or even capital punishment, litigious justice in the form of court decisions and typically some sort of financial penalty, moral justice, poetic justice, social justice, climate justice, and so on. Justice is both a concept and a practice of sorts. It's an ideal of fairness and equity and balance, but it's also a process subject to all of the mechanics of any other human system. In a democratic society, justice is situated at the core of its functioning because it assumes all parties are equally governed and equally subject to the laws of that democracy's governance. So when a system of justice begins to lose credibility, democracy begins to fail. I think a lot about justice as an American citizen. Our history is so full of miscarriage of justice as a normal practice of law, and yet our ideals as citizens of a free republic is such that we think that institutions of justice have almost magical qualities that transcend the normal features of humanity. And this is obviously ludicrous, but there you have it. Americans are full of contradictions. Justice is called out in our Pledge of Allegiance. Another thing I have personal beef with and have done for my whole life, really. I remember being in grade school, and I would always stand up and half-heartedly place my hand upon my chest, nearish where my heart should be, and I would just stand there silently until it was over. I don't like pledges or oaths. Allegiances worry me, and conformity is uncomfortable for me, so I respectfully decline. But the part in the pledge that I do like is liberty and justice for all. What a nice idea. What a noble thing to aspire to. 2 thumbs up. Do subscribe. I can comfortably pledge to do all I can to uphold liberty and justice for all. But I ain't pledging in a no flag. Fuck that. I think the idea of justice resonates for people because we all want to believe that we will be treated fairly should we find ourselves embroiled in the justice system. But we all know, deep down, that's not true. We all know on some level that it has something to do with money, that it has something to do with being perceived as an acceptable part of a power structure or part of a disruptive force of subversion. Some of us play the game. Some of us allow our privilege to shield us from harm. Most of us are trying to just live and be happy. And being on the losing side of justice has a pretty damaging effect on your ability to do that. Why is justice so hard to achieve? Maybe because we don't really agree on what justice means. So I'd like to take some time to talk about ideas of justice sort of universally and how American society has shaped its identity around some of those ideals and how our government has wielded the tools of justice it has at its disposal over the decades. Throughout history, many of the stories that we carry forward culturally include some sort of miscarriage of justice, and it tells us something about power, how it's wielded, how it corrupts, how it shapes our history, and in time, our lived experiences in the world. Here are some examples of those types of stories. Number 1, Socrates. Socrates was arrested and put on trial for impiety and corruption of the youth. On the latter charge, the basis was that he was instructing young men to ask questions related to the systems that governed them, to the institutions of power, and to seek wisdom. He was convicted on both charges and sentenced to death by drinking a potion of hemlock. Now, according to the laws of Athens, this verdict and this punishment were just. Naturally, to our modern eyes, it appears almost savage in its disproportionality, but that's not the characteristic here that intrigues me. It's the charge of the corruption of the youth that I find intriguing. You see, Athens was a democracy. It ruled on the principle that all, quote, qualified citizens debated political issues, and voted in political affairs. So when youth, who were not yet qualified by age, but in all other respects were emerging into legitimate political players, began to question established principles and institutions, the earth began to shake under the feet of the powerful, and they looked for someone to blame. They found a willing victim in Socrates, and his death echoes throughout history as the death of a martyr on the altar of free thought and democratic principles. A punishment just by the standards of its time, but nevertheless, it remains a tragic injustice. Number 2, Jesus of Nazareth. Even people who aren't Christian know all about Jesus. He's got great branding. Many believe Jesus was a prophet. Maybe that's true. I certainly don't know. But his death was certainly painful and sad and full of suffering. Jesus was crucified at the direction of the governor of the state, Pontius Pilate, as punishment for blasphemy. Crucifixion was not a unique or unusual punishment. It was pretty standard practice, as is made clear by the thief who was crucified next to Jesus. If we set aside the religious implications of Jesus' life and actions and simply look at the manner of his death, I think we see a very clear situation of a political institution seeking to silence a problematic influence, which I would say by definition is not just. But again, within the confines of Roman law, it was. And the Romans had a pretty tenuous peace with the Jewish leadership in the state, and they both hated Jesus. His death was the result of a kind of dark pact to the established power dynamic, though again, within the confines of Roman law at the time. Nevertheless, Jesus' martyrdom catapulted itself into one of the world's most influential and powerful religious institutions ever. Perhaps that's spiritual justice. Perhaps that's the only true form of justice that could possibly be attained. That seems plausible to me in some respects, to be totally honest with you, though I don't hold with the tenets of that particular dogma. Number 3, Henry VIII and the pillaging of monasteries. In the 16th century, Henry VIII had a big problem. He'd separated with the Pope and made the practice of Catholicism illegal in England. He'd established himself as the head of the Church of England and did all sorts of propaganda and legal acrobatics to validate himself as the only right and divine spiritual leader of his church. He was also broke. He had spent a ton of the money in his treasury to fund his wars in France, and things were starting to tighten. He surveyed his domain, and he found that the Catholic monasteries that had existed in England for centuries were sitting on a tremendous amount of wealth. Here, he saw 2 birds that could easily be dispatched with a single royal stone. He raided the monasteries, pilfered anything of value from them, and added it to the royal treasury, destroying entire communities in his wake all over England. This was the king's justice. It was law decreed by the king, basically God on earth. Henry's reign and his destruction of the Catholic pillars of faith in England shaped much of the coming history and the continued conflicts all around Britain right up until today. The troubles in Ireland are a direct correlation to the politics of the Reformation and Henry's abuses of power. Number 4, witch trials. In the early 17th century, King James I of England ascended to the throne. I've spoken about James before, and especially related to his complicated relationship with women and witches and the horrific hunting of and execution of hundreds of innocent women. I think the injustice of these incidents, both in Britain and in puritanical America, more or less speaks for itself. But again, that's not necessarily the feature of interest here. The more salient point in this context is that James's crusade, just or not, took hold in England and in what would become the US in its earliest formation. It shaped how a power base viewed stations of society and how religious institutions should control the process of justice in a society. So while witch trials serve as examples of many different kinds of cultural revelations, here it shows us how people can easily get behind such travesties of injustice and support them as though they were the most virtuous acts a just society could perform, which is entirely perverse. Number 5, pirates. I find the idea of pirates a simultaneously sad and fun example of how justice served in an inauthentic way can come back to eat itself. Piracy has been around for as long as humans have been mariners. But the age of piracy that springs to mind for most people, the era that we see wonderfully portrayed in Disney's problematic Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, is the one that I think is a really poignant case of justice being fluid. The British Crown had sanctioned privateers over generations in their maritime tactics. Having a loyal representative not bound by the code of ethics of the military and who could pretty much at will attack and board vessels of the enemies of the crown and pilfer those goods on behalf of the crown, keeping a tidy sum for themselves, had enormous advantages. Later on, when the empire was not at war and those actions began to hurt the crown, it became much more difficult to continue to sanction their activity because now they're hurting business. So now they're criminals. And the penalties were quite severe. So, with the stroke of a pen, doing the thing that was totally fine moments ago is now a hanging offense. Now, obviously, this characterizes the justice that comes with monarchy, that is to say, the king's justice. By inference, whatever it is that the king wishes is just. But I guess what's good for the goose is good for the gander, because once privateers, now pirates, see that as carte blanche to go ahead and start raiding the Empire's ships, and they wreaked some pretty good havoc, including a whole bunch of pirates that helped America win the Revolutionary War. Number 6. Revolutions. Revolutionary justice is a really interesting notion to me because it dances on the edge of a blade, similar to the narrow distinction between privateers and pirates. In the American ethos, revolution is a noble aspiration rising up to overthrow tyranny. USA, USA. That's certainly how Thomas Jefferson felt about it, and that's not wrong in my view, though it's very reductive to ascribe to that the ineffable air of superiority in our moral position in the world. We have our share of problems and flaws, and we always have. I don't believe anyone reasonable would argue that point. Nevertheless, the American Revolution represented an epic shift in the geopolitical landscape, and democratic self-governance continues to be an inspiration in spite of its flaws. But revolution also has a dark side, and it occasionally makes uncomfortable bedfellows with terrorism. The Troubles in Ireland, or a lot of anti-war activism in the US in the 60s and 70s, are examples of that tightrope, I think. There are places and points in time where revolutions have been used by the US government as opportunities to influence unstable governments for the sake of capitalist interests, such as in Cuba and Latin America in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, subverting the real political interests of people in other nations for the sake of enrichment of a small group of already very wealthy people. And then there are revolutions that begin with that nobility as seen in the American Revolution, and then that kind of ate themselves, as in the French Revolution in 1789 and the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Powers within the revolutionary factions exacted terrible revenge on the powers they overthrew, but then they turned their attention to enemies within, targeting rivals within their own parties or people who otherwise presented a threat to their consolidation of power. Death and calamity then ensued in dramatic episodes. Number 7, dictatorial purges. Stuff like this is another sort of example of the king's justice, just in different clothes, usually military uniforms. Examples range from Lenin and Stalin after him, Hitler and the Nazi Party, Mao Zedong, Saddam Hussein, etc. In each case, the executions of political opponents are presented as a judicial exercise to preserve the ethos of that dictator's principles. Number 8, the Treaty of Versailles. Signed in 1918, the treaty's intention was to set the world right and back on a course of peace after World War I. But the European allied nations felt pretty strongly that Germany should be seriously punished and that they should be humbled in the process. The terms of the treaty more or less guaranteed that Germany would resist in violent terms at some point, and indeed, they did just that. Number 9, the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials. Both of these are very different examples, though they are, in many respects, the same sort of event. And I think that they both represent as the most crystallized moment in the history of humanity, in which the recognition of our global community is seen and acknowledged. At the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson had this grand idea with the League of Nations, and Congress gave him a big ol' raspberry and was having none of it. So, the worst fear of the European allies was realized with the rearmament of Germany's military and the threat that they didn't even give much attention, that of the Japanese Empire. There were no international laws because the League of Nations could never be legitimized, and the trouble with punishing governments or political leaders with international war crimes is that international war crimes are not a thing, not on paper at any rate. Crimes against humanity? Nope, not a thing. International conspiracy? What's that? So, at Nuremberg, the tribunal has the task of litigating and bringing some sort of justice for the human rights abuses and straight-up execution and terrorism of millions of people. And I think for the most part, there can never be justice for the murder of 6 million Jews. But you can't do nothing, right? Not after what the entire world has suffered in the wake of the Nazis. Most of the Nazi high command, including Hitler himself, escaped human justice through suicide, including Hermann Goering, who managed to commit suicide while in the custody of the tribunal, so that's fucking fishy. The rest were sentenced to execution by hanging, or pretty moderate prison sentences, all things considered. Some of them lived out comfortable lives, supported by the US or Soviet governments toiling away on rockets under Operation Paperclip. And some of them lived out comfortable lives in hiding in countries with sympathetic autocratic governments like Argentina. Some of them were hunted. One of them, Adolf Eichmann, was kidnapped by a group of Mossad agents and tried in Israel for war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was convicted and executed in Israel in 1962. From the perspective of international law, that's not necessarily just. But I'm not convinced any reasonable person would seriously condemn Israel for sanctioning the act that the international community seemed disinterested in pursuing at that point. At the Tokyo trials, the conundrums were more nuanced and more complicated in a lot of ways. To begin with, the argument that the Japanese made to justify their aggressive imperial ambitions was that they were, in most cases, simply taking back territory that had been occupied and colonized by European nations. In Japan's view, the Europeans were the tyrants, and they were violently expelled by a powerful Asian nation. And it followed then that they deserved to hold those territories themselves, that their interests were, in effect, the interests of all of Asia. Not unlike the Nazis' notions of Lebensraum, the principle of living space for the German people that powered Hitler's ideology, justifying his invasion of neighboring Eastern European countries and ultimately Russia. So how do you effectively litigate a government or political leader's action of co-opting territories when you yourself have done that for centuries and you still feel pretty good about it? And again, you find yourself in the unenviable position of having to punish a set of laws that did not exist up to that point and that your own government may have perpetrated in the past. And finally, there's the complication of the nuclear weapons that were unleashed against the Japanese people. I won't go into the many can of worms that were opened up in those acts, but for the sake of this discussion, suffice to say, the immediate obliteration of 200,000 people and untold quantities of people who would suffer and die from radiation poisoning in the years to come was, in my estimation, a punishment in and of itself. But I don't think it looks anything like justice. The Tokyo and the Nuremberg trials were necessary and flawed, but more importantly, I think they mark a new era in which international impacts of governments and political leaders is confronted with a greater practical understanding of the global consequences of their actions. I think the examples I've discussed help to illustrate that justice is a pretty elusive concept, a lot like truth. Jeremy Bentham's principle of utilitarianism addresses that fundamental complication of the subjective nature of certain ideas that nevertheless have actual consequences in a society, and he sort of settles on this idea that what benefits the most people is ultimately the good or right act. I'm aggressively paraphrasing here, of course. From this, we might conclude that a law, having been created and enforced by a democratic government, represents that utilitarian goal. But history is riddled with examples where laws in a democratic society do not represent democratic principles. For instance, penury laws, that is to say, laws that punish people for being poor and result in forced labor like workhouses or convict labor, or the Black Codes, which were a whole series of laws enacted by Southern states in the wake of the failure of Reconstruction that targeted and victimized former slaves for things like vagrancy. But anything could qualify as vagrancy. Unemployment was considered vagrancy, for instance, but so also just like hanging about in a manner some white person dislikes. Or how about property laws? That seems simple enough. You bought a thing, or maybe you inherited a thing. That's your thing, right? Well, what if it's land? And what if it's land that was stolen from a native tribe? See what I mean? It's a few mere degrees to get to the source of power in the formation of a law. And does that then make it just, merely because it originates from a system that declares itself superior? Apparently. Law is malleable and subject to other forms of corruption besides racism. Other types of oppressive power dynamics find their way into systems of laws that are echoes of the king's justice, subject to the whims of the power base. Chiefly, law and legal system is subject to financial corruption, and that can take shape in just an enormous spectrum of different horrible ways. I think most Americans have come to grips with the fact that we basically have two different legal systems in our country, one for rich people and one for the rest of us. And they sometimes intersect, but are almost never parallel. There are so many examples of court decisions that the popular opinion react to as miscarriage of justice, and most of the time they involve wealthy people. O.J. Simpson, Roman Polanski, Woody Allen. Or there are similarly examples where court cases didn't occur and popular opinion really wanted to see some kind of justice. The 2008 subprime mortgage crash, for example, where no CEOs or bank heads were held accountable for the many bad decisions they made at the expense of poor people and people of color primarily. Or the many, many, many police officers who beat or shot and killed unarmed Black people over the last always. But especially since we've been able to capture it on film when it seems like it should be so much harder to get away with it, but there are still seldom any real legal consequences. Let's further complicate the matter because humans, and consider how culture has both shaped and responded to instances of justice, or perhaps lack thereof. For instance, in the 1990s, there was this period where cable news covered high-profile trials with gratuitous wall-to-wall coverage, coalescing in the formation of entire cable network devoted to it, Court TV, and the numerous commentators and legal experts like Nancy Grace, who rode the wave of drooling devotion to celebrity gossip and the pleasure center hits of watching former heroes fall in disgrace. We love that shit. This inundation and commercialization of legal proceedings really kind of tainted our understanding of the criminal justice system as a form of entertainment. And that isn't really new, necessarily. Think of public executions. But it did also have the very likely unforeseen consequence of laying bare the double standard of the court system when it comes to prosecuting the wealthy and the powerful. And that triggered a lot of pretty deep-seated anger in a lot of people. It really is the stuff that foments revolutions if it doesn't result in meaningful change. And as a final piece to place on top of this sloppy Jenga tower, our current moment in the sphere of judiciary authority, where the future of our democratic principles is very much in doubt, but could just as easily find their equilibrium with sufficient application of pressure as counterweight to the persistent weight of oppression. And here's what I mean by that, because frankly, with no context, that means nothing. So I'll come back to it momentarily. For the last many decades, leaders of the Republican Party in Congress and in the White House have deployed a very effective strategy of identifying and in some cases grooming candidates for federal bench seats who would enact rulings that complied with a very narrow definition of certain constitutional principles. The overturning of Roe is probably the most devastating example of the culmination of these efforts. And that's certainly just the beginning of the continued erosion of civil rights into the domain of authoritarianism, all while waving a big nationalist banner overhead and promising the right rights to the right people. So in aggregate, people begin to lose faith in any idea of justice. What can it mean when it can so easily be swayed and tainted? It's very easy to become cynical when you see just how easily corruption takes hold and just how difficult it is to keep it from creeping in. Constant vigilance is exhausting. Be that as it may, moments such as the one we are in, while unique in some respects, are not unique in the whole, insofar as these tensions have been present in our nation since its inception. They are, in many respects, what define us as a country. In the current administration, President Biden has appointed more judges than any president since JFK, according to the Pew Research Center. And what's more, his appointments have been more representative and inclusive than any preceding president in our entire history. And that's a fucking huge accomplishment in my book, and is certain to apply the necessary counterweight that I referred to earlier to reestablish meaningful judiciary effectiveness at the federal level. The last few years have been really discouraging when viewed through a human rights and a civil rights lens, but I believe they are but setbacks in an inevitable wave of insistence of the acknowledgement of human dignity. In the next part, I'm going to take a deeper dive into the American ideals of justice and how our government has shaped our cultural understanding of justice, but also the reverse. How has our culture influenced our government's shaping of systems of justice? One of the figures that had a pretty outsized influence in that area was J. Edgar Hoover, former director of the FBI. Most Americans have some knowledge of Hoover. He was an epic figure, and he had an epic influence at the highest levels of our government for decades and during some of the most troubled periods in our history. So I'm going to talk about Hoover and how his personal ideals of justice influenced American society. But so too did many of his opponents, or the people he viewed as opponents at any rate. And as with all humans, Hoover came to his view of the world by an honest, if kind of weird road. He came to represent an idea that I once heard in a movie, and I can't remember right now. You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. He did the latter with gusto. We'll get into it, and I hope you'll join me. As always, I'm so grateful for your ears and your brain and your time. I hope you've enjoyed this pod, and if you did enjoy it, that you'll tell some friends about it. You can find me anywhere you get your podcasts, including Google, Apple, Spotify, Alexa, and more. If you'd like to contact me for feedback or suggestions, I hope you'll feel free to do so. I have an email address at Susie Makes a Podcast. That's SUZI Makes a Podcast @gmail.com. And I have an Instagram at the same name, Susie Makes a Podcast. Come and find me. Until next time.